Hello everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue our close reading of Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor, Adorno and Horkheimer. Today we're going to keep reading from the elements of antisemitism, the fifth chapter of the book. And last time we looked at thesis 1 to 3, and we've said that anti-Semitism is basically a projection, like the anti-Semite projects his desires, his id, his unconscious onto the Jew, and so that's how he gets to hate the Jew. But we also ended up with this idea that anti-Semitism is also linked to religion, and this is what the fourth thesis is about. So anti-Semitism takes on a religious aspect, but already the Jews were hated on the basis of religion, being the murderers of Christ. So the hatred towards the Jews was already aroused by religion, Christianity in Europe, and it was especially effective to maintain the stereotypes that the Jews suffered from. But since the Nazis and the whole idea of progress, of enlightenment, rejects religion and superstition, they needed something else to canalize that arousal, like religion did. They even realized that in the modern industrial world, people don't really worry about divine salvation anymore. In the 1944 version of the book, there was a sentence that got removed from the 1947 version, precisely about salvation. It reads, "Salvation now that the churches have been reduced entirely to the function of social control." So, in other words, believers today see their faith as just something that has, pragmatic purposes. It simply allows for social cohesion and social control. They're basically, cardinals. For them, religion serves primarily a political and social purpose rather than a personal relationship with God. And so this means that religion itself is no longer enough to arouse the masses. Just like today, being an unbeliever is less likely to get a mob aroused to kill you, depending on where you live. Quote, "To accuse the Jews of being obdurate unbelievers is no longer enough to incite the masses." So a substitute had to be found, and that came in the form of nationalism. We're not after the Jews because they murdered Christ anymore, but because they threatened the purity of race and nation. So because the hatred towards the Jews didn't disappear with the decline of religion, it was incorporated into culture. Like everyone had a bone to pick with the Jews, but they just needed a pretext to unleash their rage. So with nationalism, the masses had a new religious way to arouse their hatred. The Jews weren't undermining our chances at salvation, they're undermining our race and nation. And this proved to be way more effective than ever, than the arousal that religion was doing. You got to admit that it is pretty weird that after Enlightenment, violence against the Jews skyrocketed. What the Jews have suffered under enlightened Europe topples all the bad shit that they went through in the Middle Ages. There has to be a reason why in the age of superstition Jews were better off than during the age of reason. Like with reason, normally we would expect anti-Semitism to go down, but instead it just exploded. And so normally when we put religion and superstition out, that should decrease the violence that resulted from religion and superstition, not drastically increase. So what's up with that? Well, according to the authors, religion kind of had something that it values and that kind of put limits on superstition. Like religion was kind of aiming at truth. That's the thing that it values. Whereas Enlightenment, that accumulated into positivism, well, Enlightenment threw away truth. So if the Jews were tormented because of the superstitious part of religion, if in Enlightenment that superstitious part is all you keep, well, yeah, violence is going to skyrocket. So not only Enlightenment didn't abolish religion, but incorporated it in the cultural heritage of Europe. It also denied truth altogether, and we've already talked about this in the concept of Enlightenment, in the culture industry, and in the two excursuses. So therefore, Enlightenment without any claim to truth opens the floodgates to power. Now priests turn into cardinals without the slightest shame, and we get into pure nihilism from here on. Religion has been incorporated as cultural heritage, not abolished. The alliance between Enlightenment and power has debarred from consciousness the moment of truth in religion while conserving its reified forms. So we are talking about the divine mission of completing the task here. Again, we've already mentioned this. When in religion the task is directed at spiritual elevation, now it is directed at the purification of the bloodline and race. Instead of rebelling against oppression and, earthly possessions, against the negative passions such as, hate and resentment, which is what, religion is supposed to do, you rebel against the Jews for the sake of the worldly nation. So racial and national purity become the new Holy Grail, and the leaders of the Nazi Party are, King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table in the Wagnerian sense. The Wagnerian version. Quote, the unchanneled longing is guided into racial nationalist rebellion, while the descendants of the evangelistic zealots are converted into conspirators of blood communities and elite guards, on the model of the Wagnerian Knight of the Holy Knights of the Grail. So a little bit of context. King Arthur was a legendary king in Britain when Britain wasn't yet, Christianized. And as the influence of Christianity grew, many elements in folklore of the natives began to change. King Arthur became to be seen as a king who was looking for the Holy Grail, which is in Christian mythology the vase in which the blood of Christ was gathered, and it could give eternal life to whomever possesses it. So Arthur gathers up a team of knights around a round table, hence the Knights of the Round Table, and they go on adventures of chivalry in hopes to find the Grail. But the Grail isn't a worldly thing, but it's a symbol for salvation itself. The quest of the Holy Grail is a quest towards truth, towards morality, towards unity. And so, since Arthur is the king who brought unity to Britain, the quest of the Holy Grail is seen as a metaphor for that unity under truth. But in Germany, that story had its influence, and Wagner made a whole opera about it. It's called Percival, about the knight Percival, who is the knight that actually finds the Grail in the Arthurian legends. And the opera was controversial because many blamed it for being anti-Semitic. It portrays Percival as a pure-blooded Aryan knight, and his main villain, Klingsor, I think that's how it is pronounced, had all the Jewish stereotypes. But it's a controversy. Was the play really anti-Semitic or not? The debate is still on today. So like we know that Wagner was anti-Semite, but was the play anti-Semite? We're not even sure. But even the Nazis didn't really like the play and thought that it was too Schopenhauerian and Christian for their taste. But the idea that the Holy Grail becomes synonym with a nation purified from Jews was definitely a bit popular. So in short, you end up with fanatics that really worship the taste of discipline and think that they're on some sort of divine mission to save their Holy Grail from the claws of the Jewish monsters who have no sense of self-control. So all they do is, being on the lookout for who doesn't conform. That's what the Nazis did. They simply love punishing under the guise of discipline. Quote, the fanatical faith on which leader and followers pride themselves is no other than the grim doctrine which was earlier used to discipline the desperate, except that its content has gone astray. So basically it turns into a crusade where faith is only animated by hate towards those who do not share that faith. Just like today, many religious people are motivated by the hatred towards non-believers than by the love of God. So if love they have, it's the love of how much they hate the non-believers, and so that's the last thing that remains in the content of their faith. Hatred has taken over the place for truth. Quote, that content lives on only as hatred of those who do not share the faith. Among the German Christians, all that reminded of the religion of love was anti-Semitism. So the German Christians was a movement in Germany where Protestants sought to actively unite the church with the Nazi Party. So these were, religious nuts. They are a group of Christians who went full retard Martin Luther's anti-Semitic views, because yes, Martin Luther was an anti-Semite. He even wrote a book called on the Jews and Their Lies, where he called for the burning of synagogues, schools, and prayer books, even Jewish homes. So he advocated for the confiscation of their property, etc. So these guys went. The German Christians, they wanted to eradicate all traces of Jewishness in Christianity, even in the Bible. Like their whole religion isn't even Christianity at this point; it's just anti-Semitism. So let's just say that they were pretty appreciated by the Nazis. But this paradox between a religion of love and how it is used to arouse hatred towards the Jews isn't an accident either. Like Christianity's emphasis on absolute love was bound to create such a paradox, especially regarding the Jews. Like the hatred that is left of it in the German Christian movements is compatible with Christian love. Adorno and Horkheimer argue that Christianity isn't a progress from Judaism, but a regress. Like for a reminder, regress for Adorno and Horkheimer is when we stray away from nature. The further we move away from nature, we regress while thinking that we are progressing. So they argue that Christianity moved further from nature, whereas Judaism was closer to it. They say the latter's God in passing from a henotheistic to a universal form did not entirely shed the features of the nature demon. So henotheistic means the worship of one God, but without denying the existence of others. It's not really monotheism. Like God in Judaism was a God among other Canaanite deities. He was named Yahweh, and the Jews only worshipped that one, but then it moved into a universal God. But it didn't deny the existence of, manna, for example. Like, remember, we've explained what manna is from the concept of enlightenment. It's the terror that we experience in contact with nature during animist and pre-animist times. The Enlightenment was seeking to eliminate that fear by subjugating nature, but the more we subjugate it in order to be liberated from that fear, the more we alienate ourselves from it. So the God in Judaism takes on that terror as he turns it into the concept of the absolute self. It is a move away from nature, but not as radical as in Christianity. Yahweh, by becoming the absolute, the ultimate creator, subjugate nature, but he still maintains its terror in himself. He just sublimated that terror, or displace it if you prefer. You can still experience manna through the God of Judaism, through the transcendental relationship with him. Like we often say about God, especially in the Old Testament, that he is to be feared, that he is a vengeful God. But that's the point, actually. That terror experienced in the encounter with God is actually manna that was displaced. Like the manna that we experience in nature was displaced in the God of Judaism. So although God in Judaism was a move towards alienation, you still had some link with nature. Even though you find in it all the tropes to deny nature's power, something of it was still preserved. So the fact that God is absolute means that he becomes totalitarian and totalizing. That's check. Like nothing besides him can exist. That he denies the cyclical nature, the cyclical nature of nature. That's also check. With the God as absolute, there is now the idea that fate isn't imposed on human beings like it was supposed to be in polytheistic and natural religions. Human beings were often complaining that they have no agency because of the will of the gods, who can toy with them as they pleased. That too was manna. So to give up on the idea that nature is cyclical means that you can be liberated from the wills of the gods. Like all of those elements check the list box of God in Judaism, but because of his wrathful and vengeful nature, manna can still be experienced. Now, the idea of fate can still be around somehow. as Adorno and Horkheimer say about God in Judaism, God as spirit is the principle opposed to nature. It only stands for nature's blind cycle, as do all the mythical gods, but offers liberation from it. But in its remote abstractness, the incommensurable has at the same time become more terrible, and the pitiless statement, "I am who I am," which tolerates nothing besides itself, surpasses in its inescapable power the blinder and therefore more ambiguous judgment of anonymous fate. So the concept of God here therefore means that there is no escape from him. He will get his due no matter what, but giving him back his due, you are supposed to feel connected with the rest of creation. There is a law of exchange that must be maintained, just like in magic rituals. So if the Jews are often presented as people who value credit and debt, it's because through debt and credit they can maintain that link with the world. The flesh that Shylock wants, remember we talked about this in the last video, so Shylock wants a pound of flesh, that is actually what guarantees the connection between all beings. We are bound by the flesh, and it is something that scares us. Transformation in magical times was dreadful because in magic it's actually your flesh and body that gets transformed. Like to demand a pound of flesh, like Shylock did, means that identity isn't fixed, and that you owe your identity to other beings as well, to nature, to God. The God of Judaism demands that he is owed and settle what he is owed, and settles accounts with the defaulter. He enmeshes his creatures in a tissue of debt and credit, guilt and merit. And so this is where Christianity steps in and denies the sphere with its emphasis on love and the moment of grace. This is also found in Judaism through the promised land, the covenant between God and Abraham, and the coming of the Messiah and all of that. But these were highlighted in Christianity, and as a result, they made the fear of manna kind of obsolete. It is softened. Christianity, it softened the terror of the absolute by allowing the creature to find itself reflected in the deity. The divine mediator is called by a human name and dies a human death. His message is, "Fear not. The law yields before faith. Love becomes greater than any majesty, the only commandment." So what Judaism kept was that nature and man were not the same thing. They maintained this difference so that human beings cannot identify with God, because once they do, they don't fear anymore. And so this would let loose of their domination over nature. At least in Judaism, men's domination over nature had to be sanctioned by God, whom they feared, which put some limits on their action. But now it's like they can do so without God's sanction, being, themselves God, being identified with God. So the idea of Jesus as God means that man can find his self in the deity. So love in Christianity becomes love of oneself. Since you are God, then yes, it is easy to love. And so the laws of nature are no longer an object of fear, but they are an object of God's love. And so with faith, the faith that we are God, the law bows to us. So natural religions were kind of the guardians of those laws. You know how often we complain that when people try to force their views on science, they are following ideology. Well, here it's the same thing. The natural religions, which were deemed superstitious, were protecting nature from ideology. But now that their spell was lifted, ideology is produced repeatedly and is being reproduced, just like we've seen in the concept of enlightenment and the culture industry. The particular and the universal become one and the same. The absolute is made finite and the finite absolute. And so this is done in the persona of Jesus, and therefore we have a process of spiritualization of magic. Like, remember what we said about magic and substitution from the concept of enlightenment. With magic, things become the substitute of other things, which you also remember isn't to say that things are interchangeable or replaceable. I'm not going to re-explain that again, so go check the videos I made on the first chapter. So Jesus becomes to be the substitute to God, but also his identical in spiritual form. And so Christianity equated the sorcerer with the divinity, which in magic normally that shouldn't be allowed. Christ, they say, the incarnated spirit, is the deified sorcerer, the human self-reflection in the absolute. The humanization of God through Christ is the proton pseudos, first substitution. The progress beyond Judaism is paid for with the assertion that the mortal Jesus was God. The harm is done precisely by the reflective moment of Christianity, the spiritualization of magic. So like we said, this shouldn't be possible in the magical stages. The sorcerer wasn't God, because God, as monotheism proclaims, is opposed to nature. He is outside nature, whereas the magician, the sorcerer, is within nature. He is mimicking nature, an agent of mimesis, like we said when we explain magic. But by claiming that Jesus was God, the magician becomes deified and is therefore outside of nature. He is no longer its subject, but he is the master of nature. So when magic becomes spiritualized, then it becomes something about, about the mind. Magic is what the mind does, and so this is idealism at its fullest. The idea of Christianity brought in the belief that it is mind that operates through nature, the mind of God, and that mind is above nature. It is laying the rules of how nature operates, and so therefore whomever becomes the same as that mind gains control over nature. So to move from fear to love, nature had to lose all possible power against the mind. Only when wild animals are domesticated, only when they become pets, then we can love animals. And so this is the power of reason. What the mind does is a rationalization of its content, and therefore if magic is the content of the mind, then magic becomes rationalized. And so what the magician was trying to do, controlling nature, is achieved to a higher degree within spirituality. Spirituality is the rationalization of magic. It is like the priest is saying to the magician, I get what you are trying to do, but you are doing it in the wrong way. Let me show you how. And so the first thing that the magician has to be in order to become a Christian, like Shylock had to convert to Christianity, is to understand, that his belief is superstitious. Like animism, which is the belief of the magician, says that nature is alive by the simple fact that it is natural. It is called a hylozoist view. It means that matter is alive, but without the need of a spiritual essence. This is according to Christians. It is filled with contradictions and doesn't abide to logic. The finite, the material, the flesh, the natural can only be alive, can only move or create, according to Christians, if it is equated with the absolute. And so this is the doctrine of the soul, that without it the body is just a corpse. So therefore a bad conscience arises, where everything cannot exist as itself but must always refer to that absolute. So magicians turn into prophets whose job is to indicate that we cannot exist without the mind. They say, mind consists precisely in demonstrating the contradiction inherent in such pretensions of the finite. Bad conscience is therefore obliged to present the prophet as a symbol, the magical practice as transubstantiation. So the doctrine of transubstantiation in Catholic theology is the belief that the bread and wine, like their substance, actually transform into the actual substance of the body and blood of Christ. Like bread and wine cannot just be bread and wine, they must be the body and blood of Christ. Otherwise they are they are useless, So here magical practices must present themselves, if they want to preserve themselves in front of the Catholic Church, as symbols for Christianity. And so this makes Adorno and Horkheimer conclude that Christianity is the only religion that ever existed, because they define religion as an intellectual link to something intellectually suspect, a special sphere of culture. So magical practices are intellectually suspect, since they defy logic and reason, and so they must admit this as their sin, and therefore try to redeem themselves by linking their practice to an absolute mind. Hence they form an intellectual link to that mind, and that is religion. Believers know themselves to be sinners who have worshipped false prophets and listened to magicians, and therefore they must purify or redeem those practices by rationalizing them, by making them about, you know, spiritual journey into meeting Christ or some shit. So practices and belief systems they came to occupy a special sphere of culture, which was kind of new. This wasn't the point of any kind of practice before Christianity. Practices weren't so that you meet with the absolute, but served mostly a social function, like the great Asiatic belief systems. Pre-Christian Judaism was hardly separable from national life, from collective self-preservation. So pre-Christian practices were of course rationalized, but not to the extent of Christianity. Their rationalization remained inside the domain of the social and political survival, which depends on the organization of the labor process. The way people work and organize their labor provides the organization of society at large, which must be reenacted over and over again. So primitive societies see their survival as dependent on sacrifice. By making an offering to the gods, they can get favors from them. And so this led to the rationalization of sacrifice. I'm sacrificing my goats so that I get blessings from the gods to protect me from curses or bad omens. So my sacrifice must therefore please the gods. I must do it in the right way. So there has to be steps, certain elements that must be respected, etc. And so in other words, you turn sacrifice into a ritual by giving it a schema. But the act of rationalization comes after the act of sacrifice, which means that the sacrifice is itself a taboo, something that we had to find a justification for. The taboo is transformed into the rational organization of the work process. It regulates administration in war and peace, sowing and harvesting, food preparation and slaughter. So the basis for the sacrifice is self-preservation. It's an act of power, but therefore it's an act that offends ethically. It therefore, you know, needs a schema to justify it, to make it essential and necessary. So sacrifices are never pleasant, and they rise, you know, they rise eyebrows. You cannot, you know, shed blood without providing an explanation for it, even if it's the blood of an animal. So the same then comes to ritual. When Christianity goes on to convert the pagans, it demands justifications for their already established rituals. And therefore, as the authors say, although the rules may not arise from rational reflection, rationality arises from them. The effort of primitive peoples to free themselves from immediate fear engendered among them the institution of ritual. This was refined by Judaism into the sanctioned rhythm of family and national life. So this is pretty much psychology at play. We are talking about the idea that reason is just a way to justify unreasonable practices, or practices that were, you know, not the product of reason. Rituals and all the rules that we say are logical and rational have their basis on nothing but a fear from nature. And so what Judaism did, the sanctification of family and national life through ritual, is a product of their immediate fear from nature. So the power hierarchies that resulted from those rituals are not rational indeed, since they are manifestations of, you know, a reaction to mana. So rituals are basically the product of the unconscious. The unconscious's fear from its encounter with mana. It is the mark of trauma. Hence the role of priests in these structures. It is simply to supervise the process of the ritual to make sure that it is happening in the right way. So the priests were appointed to watch over the proper observance of custom. So it's like an obsessive compulsion disorder, where someone does something in a ritualistic way without necessarily knowing why. Like they can know why, but it's an it would be an explanatory why. Like people who need to obsessively wash the doorknobs in all of their houses 3 times a day, or as they fear something terrible might happen. Their concern is only to watch over the process of cleaning the knobs, whether or not it was well conducted. Like Like that's the point. And so similarly, the priest is doing his job. He makes sure that everything in the ritual was well conducted. His aim isn't spirituality, but making sure that everyone stays in their place during the labor process. And so the ritual is, of course, a metaphor for the whole society at large. So the point is just to make sure that the defense mechanism works. Society is the defense mechanism against nature. The aim isn't spirituality, but that the damn thing works, right? So by contrast, you have Christianity, who took things to the next level. Christianity, however, wanted to remain spiritual even where it aspired to power. So Christianity broke up with rituals, social functions. These functions, especially the ones mentioned for the Jews about family and national life, served as maintaining the self-preservation of those institutions, family and nations. Christianity saw in them a danger for spirituality. God was the God of all creatures, and an emphasis on ritual would lead people to value their family and nation more than to value their spiritual link with the fathers of all creatures. It can run the risk of making us forget that we are all brothers and sisters in the kingdom of God and that sort of thing. Hence, all sacrifices before the sacrifice of Christ are seen as deviant. The only real substitute is the first one, Jesus on the cross. And so the sacrifice of Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice because precisely it sacrifices regulated life for the real thing, which is spirituality. In ideology, it repudiated self-preservation by the ultimate sacrifice, that of the man-God, by thereby relegated the valued life relegated the valued life to the sphere of the profane. It abolished the law of Moses, but rendered what was theirs unto both God and Caesar. And so, from now on, all sacrifices must be done accordingly to their true purpose. It is not for social survival, but for the relationship with God. And as such, the principle of self-preservation is denied in Christianity. The only thing that we can sacrifice is ourselves. The only thing that is not subject to regulated life. And so, the law of Moses are the 5 books of the Old Testament. It's the Torah or the Pentateuch. They are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, in them you have the story of Adam and Eve, all the way down to the Jews being led out of Egypt by Moses and the death of Moses. So they contain the laws that the Jews were to follow as revealed by God to Moses. So everything the Jews were doing and that Jesus didn't really approve of comes from the laws of Moses. Jesus was like, you are following the rules without really believing, so changes are going to happen around here. So regulated life goes to the sphere of the profane. Seeking, self-preservation, seeking to maintain life is devalued, while the ultimate sacrifice is really what's virtuous. So when Jesus says that we have to render what is God's to God and what's Caesar's to Caesar's, it means that we cannot confuse the realm of self-preservation, now that is Caesar and politics, with self-sacrifice and faith, and that would be God. So from now on, there is a divide between secular authority, which can either be confirmed or usurped, and salvation, which is now the domain of Christianity. In order to be saved, one has to imitate only Christ and to sacrifice themselves in the name of absolute love. In this way, self-sacrificing love is stripped of its naivety, severed from natural love, and turned account as credit. The love mediated by ecclesiastical knowledge is preserved as immediate love, in which nature and the supernatural are reconciled. So sacrificial love is separated from nature. It's separated from the natural, bodily, and erotic love, and as such, it paradoxically owes nothing to empathy and solidarity. The only thing that matters is your relationship with God. So even solidarity, when acknowledged, is like the prophet, a symbol for the love of God. So the imitation of Christ and his self-sacrifice is imposed and instrumentally and rationally turned to account as credit before God. But then, since this love is presented as real and the immediate, in it you have also the affirmation that mind and nature are reconciled in it. So this is asserted as a fraud. Therein lies its untruth, in the fraudulently affirmative interpretation of self-forgetting. So self-forgetting means self-sacrifice. You forget yourself in order to be united with God, but it is fraudulent because it blames the pre-Christians for neglecting their true bond with God for the sake of blindly following traditions and customs, while also asserting that there is a right teaching to follow if you need to get salvation, but there is no guarantee for it. Like, the point of Christian love is to be fraudulent because it is a non-binding promise that you make with God. You don't know if by leaving the tradition you will get salvation, but the church needs you to believe in its teachings nonetheless. So Catholics and Protestants may differ on what constitutes the teaching, but they agree that their believers need to believe in the teachings. But then a problem arises, as they say: the non-binding nature of the religious promise of salvation, the Jewish and negative moment in the Christian doctrine by which magic and finally the church itself are relativized, is tacitly ignored by naive believers, for whom Christianity, supranaturalism, becomes a magic ritual, a nature religion. So the idea of that non-binding promise in the Christian doctrine was, the Jewish and negative moment in Christianity, because it sought to place human beings into the undeterminacy that he experiences mana, which was displaced in the anger and vengeance of the Jewish God, which then got alienated furthermore into the non-binding promise of love. So in that moment, magic and church were relativized, meaning that they are seen as the same thing, or let's say degrees of the same thing. Like, following the church's teachings is better than following the laws of Moses, which is better than following the magicians, but it's still missing the point, and the point is self-sacrifice. But then, since the church claims that its teachings is the closest to salvation, then salvation becomes the teachings of the church rationalized, and therefore the status quo is spiritually sanctioned, and the distance between your present state and salvation is translated into an unbroken bond with the existing power structure that is hyper-realist. Like, Christianity becomes supranaturalism. It is the belief that there are things beyond the natural world, a structure that cannot be reached through the natural, and this therefore makes the distance between you and salvation even more unattainable. If the status quo is the closest thing to salvation through spiritual rationalization, but at the same time the status quo is what makes people forget about salvation, then we are screwed. You see, you kind of see the problem. It's like we are denying you a ritual to impose on you another ritual, but without the guarantee that the ritual will work. That's how you demonstrate your love. It's by letting go of all of your chances at self-preservation, hence the self-sacrifice and self-forgetting. But then this itself turns into a ritual. The denial of self-preservation becomes a self-preservation. Self-sacrifice becomes the new status quo, and it regresses back into a natural religion. They believe only by forgetting their belief. They convince themselves of the certainty of their knowledge, like astrologers or spiritualists. So the fanatics, the hardened faithful, they dismiss that non-binding promise, just like the German Christians dismissed the love in the religion of love. What remains is a fanatical drive to confirm their own faith and salvation, to banish their own doubt in an attack on the other. So when Jesus said, "Love thy neighbor and thy enemy," as to bring in an ethical relationship with the other, that emancipatory content is dismissed. You only end up with people who are more concerned with hating those who don't believe in salvation and the religion of love than in actual salvation. In other words, they become religious about religion, about their salvation and self-sacrifice. Everything in life must reflect that everything points to salvation. So these become simple-minded people, which of course represent the majority. To the simple, however, religion itself becomes a substitute for religion. And so Adorno and Horkheimer use two contrasting images to illustrate this. They compare an Italian old woman who lights who lights a candle for Saint Gennaro to protect her grandson at war, and the priests who bless, the weapons of the soldiers who go to the war. Now, Saint Gennaro is the patron of Naples. He is one of the most important saints for the Catholic Church. He was a martyr who died during the Great Persecution. It was a series of attacks against the Christians in the Roman Empire during the 3rd and 4th century BC, and so the authors argue that the woman is closer to truth when she lights the candle than the priest, because the whole story of Saint Gennaro is that he is powerless against weapons. Saint Gennaro, the legend goes, was thrown into a furnace and came out unscathed. And in another legend, he was thrown to wild beasts, but they refused to eat him. So the protection he receives is based on his faith and willingness to sacrifice himself. God protects you when you accept that you have no protection. So you have a person who knows her faith, the woman, who is putting on the self-sacrifice by lighting just a candle, as if lighting a candle will protect her grandson, while the others, the priests, think that blessing weapons is going to protect Naples from the enemy. So they even make this parallel between official and anti-official philosophers. The anti-official philosophers they mentioned are Blaise Pascal, Soren Kierkegaard, Karl Barth, and Gotthold Lessing. They are also theologians who put the idea of self-sacrifice as the center of their theology, and to stop looking for guarantees. So being aware of the meaning of the non-binding promise of self-sacrifice and how it can turn into a mindless ritual, they produced works to defend that idea, which earned a fun title by Adorno and Horkheimer. They say in this awareness, they were not only the radical Christians, but the tolerant ones. So like Pascal is known for his saying, "Le cœur a ses raisons que la raison ignore." It's taken from an aphorism from his Pensées, aphorism 277, and it's about religion. Like belief in God for Pascal is a matter of the heart and not of reason. So, le cœur a ses raisons que la raison ignore, it means the heart has its reasons that reason ignores. So it's about belief in God, like we believe with the heart and not really with reason. Like reason doesn't understand the reasons for the heart to believe in God. As for the others, you have Lessing. Lessing too is known for his play Nathan the Wise, where his character Nathan is asked to say which one among Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is the correct religion, to which he responds that there is no correct way when it comes to belief in God. Like for Lessing, revelation, the Bible, and sacred texts aren't the way to reach God. And Kierkegaard is known for his leap of faith. The belief in God is about a leap of faith, taking a leap of faith into the unknown. You must always make choices for Kierkegaard without ever knowing which choice is the right one, and there is no reason to be used to help you do that. Like reason cannot be helpful. You cannot know which choice is the better one. And then there is Barth, Karl Barth. That you can to know Barth, you can just check the Barmen Declaration. It's a document that he wrote in large parts during the Nazi regime that specifically opposes the German Christians movement and targets Hitler as a false god, and argues that there is no hierarchy in the church other than Christ. And so as for the others, who were the official ones, they didn't want to make that sacrifice. Instead, they wanted to use reason. They wanted to rationalize their belief in self-sacrifice and simply spend their time persecuting those who don't use reason for those purposes. The others who repress that knowledge and with bad conscience convince themselves of Christianity as a secure possession were obliged to confirm their eternal salvation by the worldly ruin of those who refuse to make the murky sacrifice of reason, that is, the religious origin of anti-Semitism. So there you find the religious origins of anti-Semitism. It is in your refusal to make the murky sacrifice of reason. The ongoing rationalization of sacrifice to the spiritualization of magic had this danger that while it was supposed to lead to the sacrifice of reason led to the sacrifice of those who don't abide by it. So the Christians who hate Jews have just convinced themselves that they are Christians out of bad consciousness. Their Christianity is a defense mechanism, like in psychology. People have defense mechanisms that only make things worse, but they hold on to them because they guarantee some sort of self-preservation. It is their secure possession. Like as such, their salvation feels like guaranteed the more they persecute those who don't abide by the progress of reason, those who repudiated the conversion to the rationalized, the spiritualized religion of Christianity, and those are the Jews, the murderers and killers of Christ. So Jews have been the image of regress for the Christians, and thus their salvation can only be attained by the worldly ruins of Jews. Christians can only attain salvation if they ruin the Jews, and therefore the faith of the anti-Semite Christians turns itself into a sacrifice that must be rationalized and becomes a ritual. And that sacrifice is the sacrifice of those who don't see the justice and necessity of sacrifice. If you say, don't sacrifice me, then you don't see the necessity of your sacrifice for the happiness of the world, therefore you must be irrational, and therefore you must be sacrificed. Hence, Jew hating and sacrifice becomes a ritual for the anti-Semite. Anti-Semitism is supposed to confirm that the ritual of faith and history is justified by ritually sacrificing those who deny its justice. Hence the denial of the old, the denial of traditions, of the rhythm of national and familial life in pre-Christian Judaism didn't bring about progress, but even more violent regress. Like when children turn against their fathers with the confidence that their father is outdated and obsolete, that they have to die in order to make room for the new, the optimized, the better, the spiritualized, the child. And in their act, they bring more chaos and bloodshed than their fathers ever did, despite the warning of their fathers. The adherents of the religion of the Son hated the supporters of the religion of the Father, as the one hates those who know better. This is the hostility of spirit hardened as faith in salvation for spirit as mind. So we find again the trope of those who live in the past had better knowledge than those who live in the present. The fact that those of the past know more and better than those in the present is an insult for the latter. Those who live in the present, they find no other means but to retaliate when you say that those who live in the past know more than those who live in the present. So they construct their own ways of coping with this by being sure that they are on the right path and that the price for it is never too much. They can throw away their mind if they want, since all they need is their spirit hardened, like someone who has a blind faith in salvation. So being sure that you have earned salvation dispenses you from thinking, from having a mind, because when you think, you realize how much you don't know and how much cannot be rationalized. The fact that you cannot rationalize something is harder for the salvation fanatic. It is the return of mana, of what cannot be grasped by reason. So the Jews have become just that. They become a reminder of mana for the Christian fascists. What is vexation for the Christian enemies of the Jews is the truth which withstands evil without rationalizing it, and clings to the idea of unearned beatitude in disregard of worldly actions and the order of salvation which allegedly bring it about. So, the two things that the Christian enemies of the Jews cannot withstand is the idea that truth can live without having to rationalize evil. The fascist is obsessed with rationalizing evil. Either his own evil, like everything evil he does, is out of necessity, or rationalize the evil of the world. If something is wrong, then it must have a face on it, that of the Jew. The Jew becomes the explanation of evil. If something goes wrong, it's because of the Jew. And so this will be further developed in the next thesis. And the second thing is that truth clings to unearned beatitude. That beatitude isn't a question of merit, and therefore neither worldly action nor the order, or let's say the cult of salvation, can bring it about. Fascists cannot live on with these facts, because everything that they do, all the lives that they killed and sent to their deaths in the camps, were all coped with precisely that belief. To see the blood on their hands would make, would make anyone go insane. So their only chance for coping with it is the belief that all of this would pay off somehow. And that's it. That's the fourth thesis of elements of anti-Semitism. As always, I hope that you find it useful and that it helped you understand better this complex book. And next time we will go through the fifth thesis. And till there, I see you. Thank you for watching, and I will see you.